This virtual festival has been organized by Youth Celebrate Diversity, and the festival is proudly sponsored by Boeing.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the LGBTQ panel. My name is Luke Ortiz-Gravi. I'm one of the students on the YCD Virtual Board, and here are all the other speakers, panelists getting ready to join me now. So today, we're going to start with introductions from all the panelists, including myself. We'll give a little bit more about myself. Then each of the panelists will answer some prepared questions, touching on different identities, personal experiences, the coming out experience, and a lot more things. Finally, at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions throughout our panel discussion, or we'll prompt you at the very end, if you have any questions, you can drop them in your chat. And with that, I'll start by introducing myself. Again, I am Luke Ortiz-Gravi. I am a senior at Skyview Academy in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. I have been with YCD for 3 years, and I also intern with an organization called the Interfaith Alliance in Denver, Colorado. I also am the co-chair of the Cherry Creek Diversity Conference this year, and have just done a lot of things surrounding diversity. And I think YCD and other organizations are where I found my community throughout high school. So it's just nice to give this opportunity to connect with others, to students across the nation. And with that, I will pass this off for introductions to our first panelist, Sam.
Hi, Sam Carwyn, she, her, hers. And I also live in Denver, Colorado, or actually technically in Aurora. I just moved here a few months ago. And I identify as bisexual. I'll tell a little bit more about my coming out story later, but I am a parent. I have a 13-year-old, and I also was a foster parent for 4 years. And so I have various young people I've had the opportunity to work with and partner with on their journey to adulthood. I attended Catholic school, K through 12. Most of my background was in Catholic school, college in Omaha, UNO. I did social services work. I went back to school and got my master's in teaching, and I taught for a couple years in that field. I currently work within sexual health, and that's what I've been doing for about 3 years now. And I'm open to answer any questions you have.
All right. Ev, would you want to go ahead and do an introduction?
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Ev Evnan. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I'm also in the great city of Denver, Colorado. I'm originally from Lincoln, Nebraska. Went to college on the East Coast, lived in Boston for about 10 years, moved to Denver about a year ago, and I'm loving it here. I am a white Ashkenazi Jewish person who is transgender, non-binary, gay, queer. There's been a lot of different identities that I've moved into and moved through in my 32 years of life. And I'm really excited to be able to share my experiences with some of you.
All right, thank you. And Drew?
Hi, everyone. My name is Drew, and Drew Ramos, sorry. I am currently in Lincoln, Nebraska, but I actually live in Denver. I'm just staying here for the weekend with some friends. So, hey, I'm an hour ahead of most of my peers here with this. I grew up in a small town about an hour and a half west from here. I am of mixed background. So what I mean by that is that my dad is of Mexican descent, and my mother is of German and Filipino descent. I mainly grew up in my small town. I did spend some time in a very large suburb in a very high socioeconomic status community, and there was just a very stark contrast. So I have that a part of my background as well. I went to school for political science, and I'm actually going to be finally graduating here in May, and I work as a corporate trainer.
All right, perfect. Thank you all for those introductions. And with that, let us launch into the first question, which is, do you feel like you are represented within your home communities? Sorry. Would anybody want to start by answering that?
I can do it, especially because I forgot I also identify as well. I think if you can see the faces.
Yeah.
Also, I do identify as gay. I use he or she, or his or him. Let's see. In my home community, do I feel at home? That's a very complex question for me because it depends where I am. I definitely feel at home with the LGBTQ community more so than I do anywhere else. You know, I don't feel like I have to explain myself as much, especially with other people of color who are also part of the LGBT community.
Mm.
I think home community can mean so many different things. So, you know, I think of Lincoln, Nebraska as like my home. Although I'm really happy to start thinking about Denver as my home too. But even within that kind of geographical context, to narrow down a little bit more, specifically like the Jewish community in Lincoln, Nebraska feels like my home. You know, there's like about 600 families total in the entire city. And I remember when I first started coming out, I was in high school. And so this was 2004, 2005 was when I first came out as something other than straight. And there was this like newspaper article about me, and it had like a big rainbow down my face. Like it was very apparent that I was very gay in this newspaper article. And I remember going to synagogue after it was published, and my grandma's best friend, this wonderful, you know, older Jewish woman named Marsha, came up to me and she was like, "That was such a great article. Excuse me, you know, it was so wonderful." And I found nothing but support in my Jewish community as I was coming out as not straight, and then later on as not cis. And now I am the Shaliach Tzibor, the community leader for the High Holidays. So it's an absolute honor and privilege to be able to go back to my home community as an adult, as a medically transitioned trans person, and fulfill a leadership role. Because, you know, when I was growing up, I didn't have trans people in leadership roles. And there's a young trans man who I've known since he was a baby in my congregation back home. And again, like in Judaism, there's this concept of Lador Vador from generation to generation, and thinking about the ways that intergenerational work doesn't have to be amongst biological families exclusively, thinking about the ways, especially that being queer gives us opportunities to pass on community, pass on knowledge, pass on the beauty of our identities in so many different ways. So that feels really, really special to me that I get to go home and do that.
I think for me, what I have found, especially within the LGBTQ community, there tends to be kind of a hierarchy of numbers, if nothing else. So in my home community in Omaha, I found there weren't a lot of out bisexual people, mostly due to biphobia, and especially if they were in relationships with different gendered people versus if they're in relationships with same gender people. Just the level of community that you feel is vastly different. And I saw that when I had a partner that was the same gender as me versus when I had a partner that wasn't. Just the way I was perceived in that community was different. And I found the most happiness in that community working on boards and with nonprofits that are really about how do we educate and move the community forward. That's where I really started to connect with people who had the same goal as me, which is ultimately how do we make our community better through education and through shared experiences, and recognizing that generally speaking, people are struggling just from a lack of information. So that's been the community that I feel like I'm really connected with, is that education-based community. And then outside of that, being an African-American person and going to Catholic school, I was the only person in my school that was African-American, aside from my sibling at my first school. And there was only 2 others in my second, in elementary and middle school. So really figuring out like who I am and what my communities are have been an opportunity for me to just be my individual self and be confident in that, which I think takes time and struggle just to get used to. But ultimately, then you can build a community around you that loves you and accepts you as your authentic self, because that's all they've ever known.
All right, thank you. One important thing that I would want to touch on that everybody mentioned is that everybody belongs to multiple communities. And I think this might be important for the viewers to recognize, is that there's communities based off of your geographic area, communities based off of identity, interests, anything really, and there's a lot of varying levels of acceptance within that communities. And I think just what I would want to see from my personal experiences too, being a LGBTQ kid in a more traditional area, is that you just find the communities that truly accept you and you explore all the communities you're part of. And as long as you find one that you feel comfortable in and you can grow into your true self within, I think that's really just an important thing that a lot of the viewers could recognize. Does anybody have anything else they would like to add for that question?
Sorry, I didn't really touch upon this. I kind of talked about it in my intro earlier, but I did grow up in a small town. I did grow up in a very small Midwestern town in Nebraska. It's very, very white. So it's somewhat shifting. I wouldn't say that it's going to be this beacon of diversity and different kinds of communities that you would see in a place like Denver, where I also live. For me, I feel complete. I'm still in a weird place on where I actually feel at home with that, and I'm coming to reconcile with it a lot more because I am living in such a larger city than I have ever have before. So that has brought up a lot of things to me. But growing up, I was my brother and I. My family, we were the diversity in town. We did have a couple of other Filipino kids, believe it or not, that I went to school with, and it wasn't until about maybe 4th or 5th grade that I knew that there was other kids of color in my neighborhoods, and I was definitely the only out kid for a really long time in my high school. So that also brought up a whole nother thing, because my thing with it, and we can save this for it too, but this is just kind of a way to segue into this, is that when I can't hide this, I'm not going to hide the other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally understand that. And just one quick question for you, Drew. How has your small town, like growing up in a small town, how has that shaped you or influenced you moving to Denver? And how does that affect your current Denver experiences?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've really reflected on that too much, just because I found it much more easy to adapt to. I don't feel eyes on me as much as I have before. I feel a lot freer, and I'm just getting used to that. And it's also, I don't know. It's still very fresh to me because I've only been here since June. So I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. But it's very different, and I love it. And I wouldn't change this experience for anything.
Yes, thank you. All right, I think we are good to move on to the second question, which is, when did you come out, and who were the people you came out to? And this is also in honor of National Coming Out Day. So happy National Coming Out Day, everybody. Yes. All right, would anybody want to start with this one?
I can go first if that's all right. I think for me, I think I had a conversation. So there was a friend I had, and I think I recall, I had a conversation probably my sophomore year in high school, a girl that already identified as bisexual, and she kind of went down her list of how she knew. And I always joke that everyone kind of has their magic checklist of like, these are the ways that I know, and everyone's checklist is different, but you kind of have a list that like tips at some point. You're like, okay, yes, this is where I am. And so her list was nothing like mine. So I think it took me a little while longer. If I would have had more conversations with other people who identified in that way, I think I might have gotten there sooner. So I had a conversation with her, and then I came out my senior year of high school, mainly to my friends, my circle, and then my siblings. And I didn't come out until in work environments until I met, until I got in a serious relationship with someone who was the same sex as me. That's when I came out kind of across the board with like my extended family, with like my grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles. My dad's the oldest of 8, and my grandpa's in the middle of 13. So we have a huge family on that side. So that's really when I started to come out more in my family structure. I was out in my church. I was grateful to be part of a inclusive church. And so that was not hard for me once I was in that church environment, definitely in a Catholic school. It was harder to come out, but I look at my experience coming out and my little sister's 1 year below me and how many more kids came out that year. And it just continued because of that desire of just being open. At some point, I think you just realize you're going to find ways where you don't feel the need and times when you do. But ultimately, for me, it was just finding a partner that I didn't want to hide. And so it became more relevant for me to be out versus previously it was an identity I had, but I didn't see if it was relevant to a situation.
So I watched this movie called But I'm a Cheerleader. And there's same gender relationships in it. And I was watching this really dreamy butch woman named Clea Duvall making out with this other woman. And I was like, why do I have all these butterflies right now? And then I was like, oh, it's because I'm gay. But also as a trans person, I think the idea of coming out is so interesting because, first of all, not all of us come out as gay before we come out as trans. One of the things that we like to say is, if you've heard one person's trans story, you've heard one trans story. Every single story within the trans community, within the LGBTQ community, is so beautifully, uniquely ours. So, there was coming out as not straight in high school. My mom, it was a little challenging, certainly not the worst, but a little challenging. My dad took me out to coffee and basically came out for me. He was like, so I don't think that you're like into drugs or having problems at school. I think you're gay. And I was mortified, but he was really supportive. And then, like I mentioned before, there was this big newspaper article coming out about me. And, it was pretty clear from this article that I was not straight. And a really good piece of advice I was given by some of the GSA leaders in Lincoln was, if you can help it, don't come out to your family via the media. So I knew that before this article came out, I needed to talk to my parents, talk to my grandparents. And, I remember talking to my grandpa of blessed memory, and, he was conservative. So I was a little nervous for the conversation, but I said, Grandpa, I have something to tell you. And he said, well, what is it, honey? And I said, well, Grandpa, I'm gay. And he said, well, that's nothing new. So, I think that sometimes people surprise you. But then coming out as trans, similarly, watched this documentary about people who had been assigned female at birth, did not identify as women, called up the person that I was dating at the time and was like, I think I'm genderqueer. And this person was like, duh. But I am so grateful that I've, again, been able to move through so many identities, because I'm so grateful for the different perspectives that these different identities, and especially the different ways that I've been able to embody different identities, have allowed me to see the world. I'm so grateful to be queer. I'm so grateful to be trans.
Yeah, who was the person I came out to? That's a good question. Well, let's start when I realized I was gay. I was queer in some way. Most of you are really, really young. There was a time that MTV played this thing called a music video. And that's all they played. And I was allowed to watch very copious amounts of it at a very young age. Whether my mother was fully aware that my cousins were letting me do this is a whole nother story, to be completely honest. But one of my earliest memories of just anything is watching Madonna's Vogue video. And I identified with that at a very young age, and I don't know why. It just... The faces, the way that they were presenting themselves, they're these very attractive men, and they're being feminine, they're being masculine at the same time. And it was just such a beautiful thing to me. And it just has always ricocheted through me throughout that moment. And, it was at that point, then later on, I would figure out that I had same-sex attraction. I was probably about kindergarten when I first had my first crush on somebody. It's another boy in my class, which is really weird to think about. But I didn't know that there was a word for it until about 4th or 5th grade. And that's kind of when I knew, all right, this is going to be a thing. And I started coming out when I was in high school, and it wasn't really a thing for me, I guess. I knew I wanted to do it, but it was more like, when do I actually jump into the water to do it? And the first person that I actually came out to, I was in freshman year, was a relative of mine. And then it just kind of spurred from that. When I came out to my mom, like maybe a year later, she basically told the whole family and not let me have my voice in that. And that actually saved me a lot of trouble, I guess. But I was also a little annoyed that I didn't get to have that moment for myself. My dad wasn't, I didn't really grow up with him too much in the picture. He would end up finding out I think my junior year in high school. I think I came out to him right when we started having communication again. And since then, I like I said earlier, I can't hide this. I'm not going to hide the other parts of me that make me special. So that's just kind of how I live with it.
Nice. All right. And then one question that I would want to pose to everybody in honor of National Coming Out Day, and just kind of with the viewers, what would be one piece of advice you would give to maybe somebody who's younger and is struggling to maybe come out to their parents, or just worried about other people's reactions? And based off of your own experiences, what would be one piece of advice to that person who's maybe struggling with this, with just coming to terms with their own identity, trying to discover themselves, or trying to just let people know, or even if like feeling the pressure that they have to let people know?
So you are in charge of your story. There will be times that other folks will try to take charge of your narrative, but it is your story and you get to decide how it's written. I think the biggest piece of advice I can offer is find your people. I think that having supportive friends when you're coming out, especially when you're coming out to family, especially when you don't know how it's going to go, having the people who have your back no matter what, there's no substitute for that. You're finding your people as a queer person, I think, is like one of the most important things that we can do. And they're out there. Your people are absolutely out there, and they can't wait to find you too.
Perfect. And I think that also touches a little. Oh, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Luke.
Oh, thank you. I think that also just touches a little bit more on like people's sense of community. And again, with the last question, it's like finding that community that truly supports you. And I think all three of you definitely found that your own community and have grown into the people you are today because of that community.
I would say when coming out, a few things. Think about the safety of it. I think a lot of times people think about the physical safety, but they don't always think about the emotional piece of it. Like, what is the relationship I have with this person? And how is that going to change or be different? And am I ready for that change or that difference? When I came out to my school counselor, I always say she saved me because I came out to her first. She was an amazing support throughout high school, but she didn't set me up for those supports in college. And I really struggled in college because I didn't have a transition plan. So like thinking about, like, I was very safe in that one setting, but that didn't continue into other settings. And then my sister, I had one sister that I came out to, and she was kind of like, well, every girl is bisexual, and just not really being able to comprehend what that difference was for me and why that was important for me to say to her. So I think thinking about safety is huge, but I also just think recognizing the importance, not just for you, but the people around you. I always think of that cheesy Shel Silverstone poem where they're like walking around with a mask and they can't find their people because the other person's also walking around with a mask. And I think that's what it is sometimes. It's hard to find your people because you're not allowing yourself to find those people and being really authentic because of fear. And the reality is other people are feeling that as well. And the more I've been engaged in the community, even if I don't have a lot of friends with the same label identity as me, I've been able to find people that I can connect to and be out with and authentic with because I chose to be really straightforward in the beginning. and just set my lines where they were and not change them for anyone.
Perfect. Thank you. Drew, do you have anything else you would want to add?
I do. I have a very different kind of story from them because I was very solo on my coming out journey, and I very much did it on my own because I lived in such a small town. And what I did, and I say this to everyone, it was kind of stupid, you know. It was just I was being a little reckless with it because I was the first one that I knew that was doing it, and I don't regret it. But I'm going to ask any of you who are in that same situation, please, for yourself, especially with all the things that emotionally I went through and the outcasting that happened with it. I ask that you really think about that before you do it. Wait until you know you're strong enough to do it. And, you know, I thought I was strong enough at the point that I did it, and sometimes I don't think I was. But again, it was out there. I couldn't take it back, and I don't regret it at all. But I want you to take care of yourself before you decide that you're going to change everything for everybody else and yourself.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for those pieces of advice and experiences. I think now we are going to shift into the Q&A aspect of this panel. So if anybody on any of the live stream platforms wants to just drop their question in the chat box or anything like the chat box that you see on your individual platforms, and we will answer all of those questions. Oh, here is one question. How did religion affect your life after coming out? How do you know if it's safe?
So for me, when I think about home communities now, queer and trans Jews are like some of my deepest people. Judaism is a religion where there's just so much to know. So getting to nerd out on the nerdy things about Judaism with people who share at least some of my identities has been liberating and beautiful. But I know that not every single religion handles LGBTQ identity in the same way. But there are parts of every single religion that are really, really affirming. So, you know, if the specific religious community you're in isn't the most affirming, there are others out there. And Sam has a lot of knowledge about in the Christian faith where you can access Christian communities that are full of LGBTQ folks and affirming of LGBTQ folks. So again, you know, I think that one of the things that happens to queer folks is sometimes we're dislodged by virtue of other folks' intolerance from some of the spaces that we've grown up in, some of the spaces that feel like home for us. But there are other spaces that after we become dislodged from those that can feel like home. So Sam, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, I will.
Awesome.
I think there's two parts. The first part I always try and tell everyone is we have to separate the doctrine and the hierarchy from the people. There are some various faith communities that their doctrine or their hierarchy might say one thing, but that's not authentic to who the people are in that house of worship. And so you might think, oh, well, everyone in this group thinks this one thing, and you can go and find a welcoming and affirming community that the people in it don't think that, regardless of what the leadership or others might say. So I think that's the kind of catch-22 of it. Definitely looking and seeing those places who've taken the stance of saying, they're open and affirming and wanting that to be a priority for them. But I think it's finding a place that recognizes you as a whole person. I ended up at Metropolitan Community Church. And I remember prior to coming to that church, I was like, I don't want to go to that church because it's the gay church. And I want to go to a church that has LGBTQ people, but that's not the center of who they are. And then I came into MCC and I was like, that's not all that they are. And that's what people portrayed them to be, but they are so much more than that. And that's the place where I found community beyond belief. And that's the place that led me to seminary, is just recognizing that people need to see faith leaders that look like them, and who not only represent some of their identities, but love them as whole people. And that was something I found in MCC, which was not a place I chose to go to prior, because of that idea of what it was going to be. So I think giving places a chance. There's another resource, Church Clarity, that kind of gives you some feedback on different communities and what they might be like before you go in. And as you build more community, you talk to people, and you can learn. And don't underestimate people's desire to change. I know there was a young person I worked with in Omaha whose faith community wasn't very welcoming, and they came out, and then the community was like, we want to be there for you, so we got to figure out how to. So don't always underestimate that, but find a place where you can handle whatever that looks like, kind of like Drew was saying earlier. If it doesn't go well, you can handle it, and if it goes well, you're prepared as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Both of those responses. Another question that we have is, what are some of the ways to be an ally to a friend or somebody you know who just came out as trans?
I think that one of the most important things is just let them know that you love them. I think that there's so much messaging in our society that tells trans people that we are less than, that we are all of these negative things. And, you internalize that stuff. As most people with men who experience oppression do. It's hard. The old adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me is absolutely untrue. Because we as humans need social connection. That's the way that our brains are wired. So when folks are saying things about you that are hurtful, it hurts. So just letting someone know that you love them, and asking them what gender affirmation feels like for them. There are trans guys that are really feminine. There are trans women that are really butch. So just because your friend came out as a trans woman doesn't mean that, you should be like, oh my God, let's get all of the clothes and all of the makeup. Like maybe she's into makeup, maybe she's not, just like any other woman. So obviously name and pronouns, making an effort is critical. I think most trans people know that there's a little bit of shifting that has to happen, especially amongst folks who have known us for a long time, but really trying to make an effort and also not putting the burden of education on that trans person. So there's so many amazing resources to learn more about trans folks, our experiences, and the amazing diversity within the trans community. Disclosure on Netflix, produced by Laverne Cox. Anything Laverne Cox does, I co-sign. But check out Disclosure. There's so much excellent material out there. I think those are the things that come off the top of my head. Sam, you're an ally to trans people. So
yeah. I want to say one thing I think that was the biggest lesson I learned is asking them like what they want advocacy to look like. Because I know for some people, if they're misgendered, they they redirect it and let it go. And other people feel better if someone else redirects it. So I think figuring out what does allyship look like for that individual person and acknowledging that and doing what you can to respect that and not minimize their feelings of like, oh, you shouldn't be worried, or oh, this or oh, that. And I think the other thing I have learned is practice outside of being in space with them. It's hard to switch pronouns. It's hard to switch how we see people. And the more we practice, the better we're going to be at it. And I was talking with my boss the other day and we were talking about someone and she's like, oh, you said they, do they use they? And I was like, oh, no, they use he. But I programmed in my brain that everyone uses they until I figure out what their pronouns are consistently. So that way I'm not misgendering anybody. And that's become my default. So I can get better at it. And I really do practice.
Also, please don't out anyone without their consent for any letter in the acronym. But again, especially trans folks, at this point, I'm read as a cis man, which is not accurate, but there are times that I feel really strong about folks knowing that I'm transgender. And there are times that I would rather not people know that I'm transgender. And usually that's dictated by safety.
Perfect, thank you. And Drew, I know you're having connectivity issues, but the question was, how would you be an ally to somebody or to a friend who just came out as trans? And I know you have experience being an ally and kind of just touching on your own personal experiences with that.
Love them. It's not difficult. Just love them.
Yeah.
And I tell this to everybody. This is always my advice. That's basically what my advice was with, when it comes to coming out and doing it solo. I had to love myself. Even if it was, I'm going to do it because I love myself. And that goes with anybody. So I'm not going to say the person who made this quote, but if you don't love yourselfie, how are you going to love anybody else? That's my best advice.
Perfect. Thank you all for those responses. And I think the one final question for today is, how do you feel race impacts the ability for people to come out?
Anyone mind if I start with this one?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So as I've shared before, I am a very mixed person. My mom's Filipina and German descent. My dad is Mexican. Prior to really knowing my Mexican side, I was fed a lie, and that's really what it is. It's a lie about machismo and how those families would be less accepting of queer people, or just femininity and things like that. And honestly, I have had quite the opposite in that situation. My dad was very accepting from the get-go. We actually have a lot of queer identified people on that side of the family. My cousin actually just came. Well, when was that? I can't remember. Anyways, I thought I was kind of cool because I was like the token, at least on my mom's side. But then that happened, and I was just like, Damien, no, please, But in that regard, pay attention to who your family group is. What lies have you been told is really what I'm getting at in terms of your own identity, and that was a really big impact for me. With that side, now with my Filipina and German side of the family, that was also not a big deal to them. I was later told on by a friend of mine who is Filipina and Eastern European descent. Her mom and I were having a discussion about it because she asked me, like, in a very Asian mom way, it's just like, oh, you're gay, you're gay, right? You know you're gay. I can't pronounce it right, but there is a term for a queer term. It's not necessarily a nice one, depending on what region of the country you are, from what I've been told. Bangla, that's what it is, Bangla. So I'm sorry if that offends anyone. The place that I came from, where my family's from, I was told it's not as offensive, but it's actually just like what everybody identifies as. But she was like, yeah, you're Bangla, right? And I was just like, yeah. Yes, I do, Lisa. Thank you for letting me know about this about myself. I've known it for years. And she said, she was like, oh, so you're used to that phase, it's because if your family loves you because they're from Manila. And I was like, well, yes, they are from Manila. So thank you for letting me know about this. So I've always heard stories of just even of Asian families not really fully accepting it. That was never a thing for them either. And that was another lie that I was told a lot. Was my mom a little shocked when I told her? Yeah, I think she told herself a lie about me. I never made it seem like I was anything but myself. And that had nothing to do with her race. That had everything to do with her.
I would just add really quick. just to acknowledge that there's intersectionality, depending on how big of a community you're in. It might be harder to find your people who have those same identities to find. For me, finding other queer people of color took a lot longer than it would have been if I were maybe in a bigger city. Definitely, I don't have any friends that have both of those identities as a bisexual and an African American woman. I know of people, but they're not in my friend circle. So just recognizing it might take you a little bit longer, might be a little bit harder to find people that fit within both of those identities. But I know for me, one of the most powerful things I was at Creating Change, and I went to a conference or a session specifically for queer people of color, and she said that it takes, generally speaking, families of color longer for that first step of acceptance, but that they get to celebration faster. And I definitely saw that within my family. With my grandma, I had a cousin that came out probably 3 or 4 years before me, and they were like ushering my grandma in the back room to like calm her down. And then 3 years later, I came to the family reunion with my spouse and our kids, and my grandma was like super amazing to my spouse, and then was like ushering my mom in the back room and redirecting her. And so just recognizing for some families that growth might happen quicker, and for other people, it takes them a little bit longer, but that doesn't mean that someone won't get there. I think having not, like Drew was saying, not deciding this community is going to be this way or that way, but giving people an opportunity to show you who they are.
And I also think that my racialized identity, although whiteness is deliberately made to be invisible, played a lot into my own coming out. My mom's side of my family is very WASP, so white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Everything is very proper. Everything has to be acceptable in very certain ways. And so I think that absolutely influenced the shame that I felt when initially coming out, because I didn't fit into this like specific white middle class narrative that I was supposed to.
Perfect. Thank you all for those responses. And I think with that, we are all out of time for today. Thank you, Sam, Drew, and Ev, for joining us today and for all your contributions. And once again, happy National Coming Out Day, everybody.
Bye.
Yes, thank you.